CNC machine discs are the future of professional disc golf. I'm predicting it right now. And I'm not just saying that because this video is sponsored by Protoflight. More on that a little bit later. Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs. And before you go straight to the comments to tell me about how I'm wrong, let me explain. Because when I first started learning about Protoflight and their CNC machine discs, I didn't even know what a CNC machine was. To understand the journey that I went on, we need to go back just a little bit. A couple months ago, I reached out to Protoflight to ask about their discs, and they kindly offered to send over a few versions of the only disc they currently make, the CNC. They call it the CNC because it's the first ever disc made on a CNC machine. What's a CNC machine, I asked myself? Well, CNC stands for Computer Numerical Control, and it's the automated control of tools operated by a computer. Basically, it's a machine that can use anything from a drill, lathe, mill, grinder, router, 3D printer, whatever, with incredible precision. Before we learn more about the specific manufacturing process behind Protoflight's discs, let's talk about how every other disc is made using injection molding. As Latitude 64 shows us here in one of their commercials, an injection molded disc starts off as tiny beads of plastic. These are very specially crafted blends of plastic polymers that can influence everything about how a disc looks, feels, and flies. That plastic is then heated up and injected at high temperature and pressure into a mold. A mold has at least two parts, a top and a bottom. And no matter how hard you try, you can't perfectly seal that line between top and bottom mold. And this is one of the reasons that nearly every single disc on the market has a visible parting line. This is where a small amount of plastic leaked out in between the top and bottom molds. But if we look really closely at the CNC, we're going to find our first clue as to how they're made, because there is no parting line on any of the three discs they sent us. Now, once the plastic has actually been injected into the mold, it needs to cool. Many injection molding machines will have a cooling apparatus right there around the mold, and it has to cool enough that it can be removed from the mold, where it's then weighed, goes through whatever quality control processes there are for that manufacturer before they hot stamp them and sell them to the customer, retailer, tournament director, whatever. But let's back up in that process. Before weighing, quality control, stamping, and shipping, that disc has to just sit there. First in the mold to cool enough that the mold can release it, and then stacked with other discs to finish cooling. And it's in these moments that how a disc will ultimately feel and fly can be determined just by the conditions of that manufacturing facility. Temperature and humidity can affect how quickly the plastic cools. The thickness of that particular disc and the properties of that specific blend of plastic will also contribute to how it cools. Some discs will shrink as they cool, changing the shape of the disc overall and the shape of the flight plate, or they may not shrink, or they might even expand out a little bit and become flatter. When you hear players talk about different runs of discs, this is what they're talking about. The mold was the same, it was probably produced using the same plastic blend on the same machine in the same facility, but perhaps the new manager turned the temperature down on the AC. Maybe it was summer and it was super hot and humid out, and some of that leaked inside the facility. And these conditions can be really hard to control, but they are one of the leading causes of inconsistencies from one run to another, or even from a few discs within the same run. When you hear people talking about why a destroyer from 2015 flies completely differently to a destroyer from this year, it's all of these things combined. How much has the plastic blend changed? What were the conditions like in the facility? And so on. But of course, you don't need 9 years apart. You could have 9 months, 9 hours, 9 minutes, and the conditions can change. And those changing conditions will, of course, have slight changes to the disc's flight. But up to this point in our sports history, this has just been an accepted fact, an accepted byproduct of how discs are made. But what if that could change? Well, that's exactly what Cody Greenfield and his team at Protoflight realized. All longtime disc golfers, they'd worked together for a while at a manufacturing company where Cody was in charge of setting up and running the CNC machines. Not long after, they purchased a mill together to start their own shop. And sitting around one day said, I bet I could cut a disc on a lathe. And after saying it enough times, they decided to try it. There was understandably a lot of trial and error, but we actually have one of those trials with us today. Protoflight sent us an interesting test flight disc that they made while experimenting with how thin they could make the flight plate, but still have enough rigidity to fly. Because of course, a thinner flight plate means there's more weight out by the wing, more gyroscopic stability. You've all seen MVP commercials, I'm sure. But while most pop-top Domi discs sound like this one sounds like this. Incredibly, they made one even thinner than this one. Apparently, it was just way too flimsy. Now, this test flight disc isn't currently in production, but it was part of their early prototyping phase, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But first, let's talk about plastics technology in general, because when you think about up-and-coming tech related to plastics, you probably think of or hear about this: 3D printing. 3D printing is an additive process where a spool of plastic is fed to a point where it's heated and applied to a surface. However, of course, based on the name of the disc, Protoflight opts for a different approach using a CNC machine in what is a subtractive process. Now, there are two different ways to do this subtractive process: a mill or a lathe. A mill uses a stationary product with a moving cutting tool, and it then moves around and cuts out the shape that you want. A lathe is the opposite. Here we have a product that's spinning at high speed, and the cutting tool is stationary. But of course, to get to this point to have something to cut out, Protoflight needed what they call a blank. Protoflight has partnered with Gateway Disc Sports to produce their blanks. The blanks are shaped like a disc, but are roughly 3 times the weight of a finished disc and are larger in every dimension. Now, I know what you're thinking. If the blanks are injection molded, couldn't they still be subject to the same conditions and factors that would make them inconsistent from one to another? And you're right, the blanks themselves will not be exactly the same every single time. But what's different here is that the blank block of plastic is not the finished shape. So any change in shape due to those conditions is not going to change the finished product. Because of course, the finished product comes off of that CNC machine. Once they receive a blank, they can put it on their CNC machine and use the lathe to remove the excess plastic until they have the exact shape that they want. And I mean exact. Oh, and by the way, all of this excess plastic is collected and sent back to Gateway to be used in future production. Now that we know how they make their discs and how they got to this point after prototyping, let's talk about the discs they make. Protoflight now produces 4 different discs, not molds, discs, and all 4 are variations of the same model. The CNC is designed to be a long-distance, predictable driver with moderate to high stability, that when thrown with power, will hold straight for as long as possible before a reliable fade, sort of like this. The CNC Plus and Minus are altered versions of the CNC. They're altered by making the leading edge a touch higher or lower. You can think of the Minus as a beat-in version and the Plus as like a beefier version. And lastly, we have the CNC-I, which we'll talk about in just a second. The premium plastic used for all of these is smooth enough for a clean release, but grippy enough to use with confidence. So what we actually have here are the discs they sent us, the CNC Plus and the CNC-I, which means that the CNC Plus is going to have a slightly different leading edge for added stability. But other than that, they are identical, but for one small difference. That difference is extremely hard to see, but when you grip it like you're gonna throw it, you will feel that immediately. The inside rim of the CNC-I is inverted by 10 degrees. Thankfully, we have a diagram that can show you what that means. Here, you can actually see the difference, whereas all other CNC discs, and most discs in fact, have a straight 0 degree inversion of the inside rim. The CNC-I is inverted at 10 degrees, which gives it a very different feel in your hand. The level of precision that Protoflight can put into these adjustments is insane. If you don't like that 10 degree of inversion, no problem. In an hour, they could have 4 prototypes, each with a different degree of inversion for you to test. To put this into perspective and understand why this is such a game changer in disc golf manufacturing, we have to understand how normal injection molded discs are made and the economies of that. In disc golf, we refer to discs as molds because they are literally produced from a mold that is made of metal, hopefully steel. And they are not cheap. Outside the United States, where manufacturing costs are a bit lower, you might be able to get a mold made for between $5,000 and $10,000. But here in the United States, you're going to be pushing $15,000 to $30,000. Now, this is for a quality mold that you're going to be using in production. You might be able to get away with something less expensive for prototyping, but you're still looking at thousands of dollars in costs. And if you want to make any change to the shape of that disc, that's a new mold. You want a different rim? New mold. Different inside rim? New mold. Money, money, money. So that prototyping scenario that we just talked about, where they make 4 different versions of a slight variation, could cost other companies $10,000, $20,000, $40,000, $100,000 in molds to make all those different discs. And that's before raw materials and actual production. Now, since they don't have these actual costs related to the molds themselves, you might be thinking, okay, cool, Protoflight's going to be able to offer this disc for a lot less money than a traditional injection molded disc. But you would be wrong, quite wrong, because the CNC costs $40, about twice the price of a typical injection molded premium plastic disc. But essentially, there is a really good reason for this, and it is time. It takes about 5 times longer to make one CNC disc than it does to make one injection molded disc. And that time costs money. But Protoflight wants to make it a little bit easier for you to try one of these for yourself. So head on over to protoflightdiscs.com if you're interested and use code 6sided to take 25% off your order. Now, to be totally transparent, we are not receiving anything from this sponsorship other than the 3 discs that we got to test and Cody's time to interview him and ask him about their company. So rest assured, the discount code was offered to you and we do not receive any commission on that. Again, that's code 6sided, 25% off your order. The link is in the description. Now, so far, I've told you that these are the future of professional disc golf, but I have not yet explained why. The manufacturing process is interesting and different. The cost is relevant, but that doesn't really explain the future of professional disc golf. By far, the most important thing about the CNC is that every single one that you order will be exactly the same. One after another, the CNC machine will make them the same. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, it doesn't really matter to me if the disc is identical every single time, then these discs probably aren't for you. But if you're a professional or even an experienced amateur player, you've noticed differences from one destroyer to another, or one of your mid-ranges to another of that same mold. And imagine what it would be like to be able to order a disc today that you've thrown before and to have it come out and fly exactly the same way every single time you buy one. Not only that, but the amount of precision that Protoflight can put into making these discs is incredible. If you know the exact dimensions needed to perfectly fit a disc in your hand, Protoflight can make that. If you know you like a specific disc but need to make a minor adjustment to make it more or less stable, they could do that. If you're heading to a tournament at altitude and you want your favorite driver to fly a little more understable so that it's the same at altitude as it was without the altitude, they could do that. So far, there just isn't anything to this level of precision in disc golf. So what's next for Protoflight beyond this first release of CNC discs? Well, we're told their next disc is a mid-range, which is in the testing phase right now, and they expect to release 2 versions of that mid-range, one straight and one overstable. They're also hard at work on a new translucent plastic blend, similar to Innova's Champion or Discraft Z plastic. And lastly, they're working on a custom disc program. No, not stamp, disc, where you can build a disc to your exact specifications. In fact, Cody says they want to even take that a step further. This is pretty crazy, but we live in a world where not long from now, Protoflight will be able to turn up at your local tournament with a CNC machine on a trailer and make a disc for you to your exact specifications while you wait. And that is just taking disc golf to a place that I never imagined. The big question, of course, will be, will people be willing to pay that extra price for that extra precision? only time will tell. Remember, Protoflight is offering 25% off your first order with code 6sided on their website. The link is in the video description. And if you don't want to pay that extra price, well, we have a bunch of old-fashioned injection molded discs on our website at 6sideddiscs.com. While Protoflight themselves may not be the future of professional disc golf, this higher level of precision in manufacturing almost certainly will be. Have you tried any discs from Protoflight? Leave a comment down below, and also comment below what you think will be the next big game changer in the world of disc golf. For 6sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. When you hear about when you hear players talk about different, and these of course are the things that are really hard to control and the things that create some inconsistencies. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, I don't really care if the disc is exactly the same every time I get a new one, then however, if you like this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, or supporting us on Patreon. Your support makes this content possible.